So kind of shifting gears to your other research, which I find really, really interesting. And it's got kind of a lot of the running thread is kind of like trying to define how morality plays out in our society.
Yeah.
So let's start with one of your studies, pro-social correlates of transformative experiences at secular multi-day mass gatherings. So first of all, just a methodological question. How do you go about collecting quality data at mass gatherings with people on psychedelics and all sorts of other substances? Like methodologically, how do you go about getting quality data in that setting? And then what's your key finding in the study?
Wow, I'm glad you're bringing up this study. This is my favorite study that I've ever run so far in my career, and it was a nightmare, a logistical nightmare to run this study. It was also combined some of my favorite things in life, which are science and a little bit of fun involved as well. So my collaborators and I we were interested in, there's been a new line of research in philosophy that's looking at what are called transformative experiences that people undergo that leave them feeling as though they're a completely different person with different values and preferences and beliefs than they were before. And an example of this is sort of becoming a parent, for example. When you become a parent, you can't really ever know what it's like to be a parent until you actually are one. And so what we wanted to look at was, these kinds of transformative experiences. And we were looking to try to identify a naturalistic place where these types of experiences are prevalent. Where do people where are places in normal life, aside from potentially the OBGYN when people are coming out, becoming a parent, but then by the time then you're just exhausted and that's really not necessarily the time to be asking people questions after they just gave birth. So we're looking for another place to do this. And what we identified were these, as it's said in the title, these secular multi-day mass gatherings, for example, with Burning Man being one of the key examples there, where people who go to these festivals, these gatherings, often have a high frequency of feeling as though they had a transformative experience afterwards. And so what we wanted to do was to survey these people and really kind of see if we could get to the bottom of this. People say that going to Burning Man changed their life. Does it really change their lives? If so, what are the kinds of changes that they experience? What are the predictors, or what are the sort of features of their experience or their activities that might lead them to be more or less likely to feel that sort of sense of transformation? And then also, what are the consequences of these types of transformative experiences down the road? So what we did was we identified 6 different of these kind of secular gatherings, and we sent a team of researchers out to each of these places, and individually. We walked around with white lab coats to show the people that we were reputable scientists. I don't know how well that worked, but that was what we did. And we carried around clipboards, and we asked people to participate in this kind of survey, this experiment that we were running. We collected over 1,000 responses at these different contexts. And then we started to use, we also then did several follow-up investigations. We contacted people a week and a month and 3 months and 6 months after they attended these different gatherings. And our main aim here was to kind of just better understand these experiences and talk to the people who underwent them. And so sort of, there was a very there were a lot of questions that we asked, a lot of analyses that we did, but the upshot here is that, number one, these types of transformative experiences are highly prevalent at these gatherings. They are more likely if you are under the influence of psychedelics or other types of substances, but psychedelics and other types of substances are not a necessary condition for experiencing these types of having these types of experiences. People who go there completely sober are also very, very likely in certain contexts to experience these types of events, and they're more likely to do so in contexts where. So one of the interesting features of Burning Man is that it is involved. It embodies what is known as a gift economy. So at Burning Man, I don't know how familiar, Fred, you are with Burning Man, or your listeners are, but just to fill them in, a gift economy is a place where, so at Burning Man, people are there for 4, 5, 6, or 7 days. And it takes place in the Black Rock Desert in central Nevada. It's a very barren area. People come and they set up a temporary, almost like a temporary city that's called Black Rock City. And they, for these 7 days, there's no money exchanged whatsoever. Instead, what people do is they give each other gifts. So it's a gift economy. In other words, everybody comes to this event with something to offer the community, whether it is an experience or a snack or a foot massage or anything like that. And so it's a fascinating place because it embodies such a different way of interacting and being in relationship to one another than what we typically experience in sort of default Western culture. And so we find that in contexts like this, there's a high prevalence of people feeling as though a sense of transformation. Not only that, but we actually find that they become more generous. We ran what's known as we ran a kind of an economic game where people have an opportunity to give a certain limited number of resources to a complete stranger. We find that people are more generous the longer that they've been at this festival, and that generosity is caused in part by a greater sense of connection to people who are more and more distant from them, what we call an expansion of the moral circle. In other words, this idea that we have a moral circle of people who we think are relevant and worthy of our moral concern. And what we find is that with every passing day that people spend in these events, they actually their sense of the radius of this moral circle gets larger and larger and larger, so that people feel a greater and greater sense of connection and an obligation to more and more dissimilar others from them. And then this causes and leads to a greater level of generosity that they show. And finally, that these types of behaviors are and associations are prevalent and observable even as far as 3 and 6 months after people actually attend these events. So that was the study.
So a lasting effect. Interesting, because modern life is more and more, I don't know if you want to say maybe fragmented. I mean, we don't have this kind of mass gathering phenomenon. I mean, you probably do now in a city like New Orleans compared to a larger city like New York, but
Sure.
Kind of meeting in a spontaneous way in the public square or in the center of the village, that's not an experience that we have anymore. And so do you think that as part of maybe, I mean, I kind of just looking at the broader consequences of this study, it would almost imply that when you're not at a kind of mass gathering, when you're more kind of, I don't know, just going to work, going home, cooking dinner, organized leisure, does it maybe limit or constrict your moral circle? I mean, certainly when you look at all kinds of studies on isolation, atomization, you see folks who live in big cities, it's kind of being alone in the crowd, that phenomenon, right? It's almost like the opposite. And it's kind of your moral circle kind of shrinks until for some people, unfortunately, there's only themselves inside the circle, right? So do you kind of go there? Yeah.
That's really well put. I think that's exactly right. I think there's been a lot of research that is looking at the decay of our communities, this is exemplified in that very well-known book by Robert Putnam called Bowling Alone. This idea that we are lacking the opportunities to engage in community activities that cut potentially across different identities, that put us in contact with people who are different from us, and that give us a stronger sense of moral fabric, that give us a sense of obligation and almost almost fulfill that need that we have to belong to something that's larger than ourselves. When people are, when I see the very strong sort of enthusiasm about places like Burning Man as in a way fulfilling a kind of a spiritual need that people have that isn't necessary, that is currently lacking in our secular modern society. There's these are the types of needs that used to historically be filled by church and religion, and there's plenty of data showing that there's a plummeting of attendance in these types of religious institutions. And so but work by sociologists like Emil Durkheim, for example, showed that people have a need for what he called this collective effervescence. And what collective effervescence is a sense of, as I said, belonging to something larger than yourself. And I think that there's something really interconnected about these ideas: the sort of decline of religious attendance, the decline of communal activities like bowling leagues and reading clubs and things like that, a deep unfilled spiritual and connective need that people have to belong to something larger than themselves, and then these all together, seems to me that it makes more sense we can better understand, sort of going back to this idea of polarization, what might be going on, because there's not that sort of third layer that binds people together. It's just the individual and it's the government. And sort of, I'm saying, I'm looking at the government and saying things are unfair. All right, the government should fix things, or that's where I'm going to put my energy and attention. That's what I'm looking at. That's the only other thing that I can focus on, because there's nothing else. And it's
available. It's online. It's on social media. I can take my phone. I'm now part of this group fighting a heroic struggle against a group that really wants to destroy Western civilization. So it gives you a sense of meaning. It gives you a sense of coherence. It gives you a sense of tribe. And in a sense, it's a reflection of the emptiness that we get at this kind of communal level in a society where we are bowling alone, in that phrase that kind of says it all, right? And that was I'm very happy that you connected the dots there, because that was going to be my next question: how this kind of, what this says about polarization, and how it maybe steps in to fill that gap, but it's kind of ill-suited to fill that gap because it doesn't give all the things that a human community will give to one another.
That's right. And we have this sense that we want to put our energy towards something. We want to make things better. Everybody wants to do something to make the world a better place. I believe that about human beings. And so, but if there's no sort of this local fabric, if that doesn't exist, then all of my energy and attention is going to be devoted towards these large scale, towards the national government, and how it's unfair or fair or all of these things, and it creates this polarization, when instead what we ought to be doing and is sort of putting our attention to more local community level issues, which could then both improve our own lives by improving our neighborhoods, and also put us into contact with people that we wouldn't otherwise, with our neighbors who we might be ignoring. I spent 10 years in New York. I didn't never once spoke to the person who lived right in the door, in the house next door. Why is that? Well, I don't know, but here in New Orleans, I'm already best friends with 5 of my neighbors. So what's the difference there? And how are these cultural factors kind of making people feel together or alone in different situations?
Yeah, that's a great access point, because sometimes we can start very close to home in your actual neighborhood with your actual neighbors. And we want to solve these distant issues and these big, complex social dynamics. But it's like, hey, do you know your neighbors? How's your family doing? A lot of times it's at the close level that we see that there's that emptiness, and I think you see it in so many different contexts.